going to start. Good evening and welcome to this meeting of the Overview Scrutiny Committee. I am Councillor Mary Wheel, Chairman of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, and I'll be chairing tonight's meeting. This event is being streamed live on YouTube, and members of the public and media are welcome to watch the meeting remotely and listen to the discussion taking place. So I'd like to welcome everybody here and everybody watching tonight. And I think it would be appropriate for us to start with 72 seconds silence to remember those who lost their lives in the Grenfell tragedy. So we have paper A1, or item A1 is to note the membership of the committee and the vice chair agreed at the council meeting. That's agreed.
Agreed.
We've had only no apologies, apologies for absence from Councillor Dunham Easy and Portia Thaxter, and apologies for lateness from Councillor Ali. Any members have? Oh, you're here! Miraculously. Sorry, I was concentrating too much.
No, absolutely fine.
And nobody appeared, like Mr. Ben. So, any declarations of interest from everybody? No? Good. Minutes of the meetings on the 9th and 24th of March. Has anyone got any? I wasn't here. Has anybody who was here got any comments on them, or can I assign them as correct?
Can I ask one question, Jackie? Did David Barrow Fox give apologies for the 24th of March?
I don't know. I can check. Could you follow that up?
Yeah. I don't think he was there, but I think he would. Just like he did in previous week.
Other than that, can I sign them as correct?
Agreed. Yeah. Agreed.
I'm going to sign them, and then it's such a minor amendment. I'm sure we can find a way of sorting it out. Thank you. The next report is our main report is a scene setting report, and I'm going to invite Barry to say a few words to introduce you. There's a limited stay. There you are. Set you up already, Barry.
Thank you very much. What the report does really is just set out what the parameters for overview scrutiny in local government, the challenges that local government has, the opportunities also that it has. It reminds members of the way in which local government is organised elsewhere in other authorities, but also how people essentially approach the issue of scrutiny and statutory guides, which I think is referred to as subsequent. This then, from paragraph 3 onwards, sets out the service priorities of the council in terms of rental partnerships, financial management, which of course normally is soporific to this council's issues of financial management. But I think that you'll know that this year is certainly something that we're going to be focused on quite intently because of the inflation challenges and particularly the issues that this will bring both to workforce supplies and also for our overall service management. And I think that it then describes particularly, I think, these issues about corporate strategy, community safety, contingency planning, because these are some of the questions, of course, that would focus on the most public inquiry. So the report then basically goes through, and on page 17 goes through the priorities. But I think what we've been looking at is what are the opportunities here for scrutiny, for your involvement. And that's the point about this, is to set the scene for you to decide about what's the nature and character of your involvement in both the forward look, but also the forward look in terms of what is it challenging us now, what opportunities are occurring now, but also in terms of the backward look, in terms of where both the council, but also other agencies, points here to responsibilities that particular committees have, for example, on crime and disorder, also on health and on environmental protection in relation to flooding. And so that's this focus, I think, on opportunities for involvement is the main issue for you to consider this evening. And happy to answer questions on any of those topic areas or indeed anything else in relation to this. Checking what's added to it.
No. So, Councillor Yankson, I've got a quick question about the £30 million budget that identified on page 17, grade 4,
Yep.
on the priorities, and asked whether that would be looked at by the OSC or whether by the audit committee.
Well, the audit committee, essentially auditors will be looking at what we've spent and how we've spent on the processes and compliance. 30 million is our forecast. It's our forecast established in late 2021 about what we anticipated to be a 3-year gap in our revenue, between our revenues and our spending on our net budget, which is an average of a sort of 10 million challenge a year. It's likely that that's now, in some areas, substantially got more difficult. It may be that in other areas, interest on balances, for example, may have got a bit better. But I doubt if the interest on balances are as great as the challenges that we have. The audit committee will want to look at things like the council's arrangements for resilience into the future, for financial resilience. So there may be a level of overlap, but I would suggest that that's not.
No.
That doesn't necessarily mean that this is out with this committee's responsibilities.
And it raises a sort of important point about where we do our budget scrutiny. We'll obviously do it in the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, but I'm very keen that all the chairs of the select committees take away and do some budget scrutiny themselves on a service by looking at some of the services. So, for example, for years adult social care have been promising that they're going to rejig themselves and save lots of money, and they haven't. Is there a role for Sarah's committee to look into that? Is there a role for Tom's committee to look into, do we really need to spend so much on roads? Those kind of things. Just taking one theme or two themes within your committee, just to look at it in a more detailed way with some benchmarking against other local authorities and that sort of thing, then has ever been done at the Overview and Scrutiny level, where perhaps we can pull some of those observations together into a sort of wider critique or a more detailed critique than we've been able to do before of the budget. But that's just something I want to encourage us to think about over the next couple of weeks. And we can't start soon enough because the budget sort of comes around so quickly.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering, the 30 million budget gap, is that a 10 million deficit over 3 years, creating it rather than a 30 million deficit?
And it's lumpy as well in profile, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not 10, 10, 10, I don't think.
No, but it can be made, it can be smoothed in such a way that the challenge is 10, 10, 10. It could be that 30 is now 40 or 50.
Yeah.
But it is, because the medium-term financial strategy can take us 3 years out. I have to say, every time we've been doing medium-term financial strategies for the last 15 years or so, the pressures have changed year to year to year, not all the strategy. So what it is is a medium-term strategy which is iteratively modified every year. I think the difference, the difference when you're in an inflationary period that we're in now, I mean, the worst couple of years of the austerity program from 2011 was really about 4% to 5% annually, 5% maximum. Well, this is more than that. And what I think that means is that it's a challenge for authorities because we budget annually. So when you're budgeting annually, you say, well, we've got 10 million that we've got to spend this year on these services. But actually, for every 100, this way, for every £100,000, we've got to spend it actually at the end of the year, it's £90,000. That's at the moment. It could get, so therefore, you know that the next year's annual budget is even different. So I think that it's not just looking at this in aggregate and looking at it council-wide, but we've got to make sure that all budget managers are managing their budgets in a prudent way going forward, because they are responsible really for the proper expenditure in their area, whatever their area is. And so, whereas we have annual budgets, we are probably managing these and monitoring these on a monthly, weekly basis now, not just on a quarterly basis. We'll be much more on top of our budget forecasts, such that we can understand where suppliers are going in terms of their increased costs and the cost that they want to pass to us in terms of whatever the supply is. And of course, the biggest areas are things like environment, social care, adult social care, and so on. So it does mean that we need to, people are used to just 1% change a year. I'm afraid when you're looking at 10%, it alters everyone's behaviour. And as an authority, we've got to be really prudent about how we deal with financial monitoring and budget management.
In terms of our larger third-party contracts, are they generally made up of an element of fixed costs agreed at the start that X has to be delivered for this cost across the period, and other elements where they can come back to us and say, look, our costs have gone up, so you need
yes,
to...
well, I mean, this happened. It's also happened in COVID in relation to income was lost. So, for example, in the leisure centres where income was lost. So, for example, some suppliers there was an announcement last week about Corey in relation to the contracts that they have with other London boroughs, that what they were paying their workforce, that increased workforce pay, and they weren't passing that on. Or they didn't give indication that they were doing that in the press release. So one's got to be careful about this, because the suppliers we've got contracts with, and it could be, and they'll all be slightly different and over a different period. So we're doing a review of the big contracts in terms of looking at what the implication of inflation is on that. But for suppliers, most of there won't be labour costs to us, but it'll be labour costs to them, because most of the supply costs, other than things like waste disposal or even large elements of waste collection, a lot of the costs are non-labour costs. Whereas in social care, the bulk of it will be labour costs.
It's worth perhaps adding that now we've got a procurement strategy, we're much better able to model the effect of inflation. So captured in that is, what is the inflationary uplift on this contract annually? Is there one or one? And I think Time reckoned that about £100 million was going to be, which was about half, was going to be affected by inflation. So
the sort of current thinking amongst is that really the impact on our budgets is probably more like 6 than 10 at the moment. Well, 6%. So when we're looking at the total inflation, of course, that includes fuel and energy across the whole of the country. Basically, 70% of Londoners travel on public transport. It's not the case in Great Manchester, Lincolnshire, other parts of the country where the majority of people are travelling by car. So fuel impacts has much less of an impact in London and even in central London, but nonetheless is still probably about 6% overall in aggregate. But we need to look at individual contracts, as you say, that with the procurement knowledge that we've got now, that will help us improve and make more nuanced and sophisticated in our approach to how we apply budget control.
Okay.
What did you Cassie?
You want to?
I've got different subjects, so if you want to carry on.
It's
Okay.
similar to this subject, but with the figures. As we are on page 17, one of the areas to look at the financial support is the new homes program. And as we have the £250 million for the new homes program and the inflation cost that has been happening, a figure of 20 to 30% was suggested. Maybe these inflation things may not work as they should work. So we've asked for a report, inflation and everything, but what I expected was not there. So I have to ask officers one more time to give me a breakdown report of what has been done, what's happening, and the focus. If we were to lose any social homes, for example, and I'm looking forward to that. So obviously, this is not the right place to talk
That
about.
sounds very
As
sensible.
as a committee, we're dealing with as a committee, we're dealing with the Women's program. But the question to move on for this Scrutiny committee is on page 19. And really, we cannot give a lot of activities that we want and support if we don't have the economy to support. So the question is 3.16, and economic development team focus on the most important issues like employment skills, enterprises, business support, and adult community learning. And the figures we have on the second page, page 20, and 3.117, I would like to elaborate a bit more. Barry, the figure of £150 million, as well as the £372 million over the next 2 years, what can give us, of course, it's the whole thing, it's not for us only, but I would like to know what tangible we can do and support local businesses so that we can support our high street businesses to generate income.
If I can just say on that, that is the information in relation to the, us administering the government
Yes.
grant. What I think we can do is to package, so we put together, this is the totality of resources, what we're doing for local businesses. That's what you're asking for.
Yes.
But certainly we'll do that. Excuse me, get more information, so it's not just a headline figure about how we're passing money through, but also what we're doing in relation to that. I think your first point was also very personal, because the contractual costs is impacting on public sector investment generally, of which homes is, particularly for us, is a significant one, but it's a very big issue in central London because the housing construction costs have gone up significantly. That we're not yet impacting. I think this will have a very important bearing on cost-benefit analysis, on viability of schemes, and then the extent to which schemes have to be cut back or whether they're deferred. I think that this is something that we're really in the middle of at the moment. All the housing directors in London are looking at social housing costs together, and I know that Dan Hawthorne was at a meeting before last, really about this issue, about what can we do about construction costs. The London councils are getting information from all the authorities at the moment to where we'll be able to see what the picture is across London. I was talking to the chief executive of London Council only Friday before last about this particular issue. So I think we've highlighted it's not just about our running costs, it's about our capability to invest. Inflation changes that immensely. And in things which, calculations which meant, that means we can do this here. Well, 5 months later, or 6 months later, 7 months later, maybe these numbers are completely changed now because the construction costs escalating. That's the problem. But we'll get that up-to-date information for the council.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mine was a different subject. So Barry, last week we passed the 5th anniversary of the Grenfell fire. what are the major inflection points over this year, both within the council that we will be involved in and can be involved in scrutinising, and more widely?
Well, I think that the inquiry itself hasn't yet concluded its oral evidence hearing. That will conclude probably within by the end of July. Then authorities, ourselves, but all of the core participants will be asked to submit overarching statements about our prior involvement and what we took from other people's evidence about our involvement. And so that's quite a lot of, we have to submit them in October. So there's quite a lot of work to be done because we've, in a sense, responded to each module, and we then being asked to sort of synthesize this and do an overarching response and bear in mind the response in others. We will be that there. I'm aware that, I don't know the details of this, but I'm aware that there's discussions between lawyers in relation to civil litigation and compensation arrangements, for example. And that will probably start in the next few weeks and months. And that's very testing, I think, for personally quite traumatizing for the families concerned, because of course they have, if we go down particular routes on this, they have, of course, to speak again about the harm that's been caused to them. And you can imagine that's the last thing we want to do, is to go through all that again. So I think we have to act with real compassion over the next few months, because it's very, very challenging for the bereaved survivors who are making claims, and we will need to make sure that that we support them through our dedicated service in relation to the difficulties they're going through. But it's certainly, this is by no means, we've passed the 5th anniversary, and therefore, no, we've passed the 5th anniversary, and there's other stages, I'm afraid, that has to be gone through. And we've got to support people during that process. But it will also be challenging for the authority.
Thank you. Any other questions? Sam?
So in adult social care and health, I see lots of challenges coming up as we go forward with the CCG going 8 to 1 and now the ICS. And I just feel that there's a move by the NHS to put more into the voluntary sector and the local authority without funding. I don't, you probably know much more about this than I do, but it makes me quite nervous.
I don't think, I don't know any more certainly about the NHS strategy in relation to how they commission to the voluntary sector. But I am aware of the sort of contested arguments really about the way in which the NHS is being reorganised and reframed. So yes, we were used to sort of coterminous arrangements in London where a social care authority and a CCG, or what's then called primary care trust before that, was organised on a coterminous basis. In the northern part of the borough, of course, it wasn't coterminous. And then we've gone from coterminous to 8 boroughs. So across these 8 authorities, the NHS will be organising themselves. I think there are major benefits in it, because you have hospitals that are cooperating with each other, and PC and primary care things which are cooperating. So I think the previous approach of sort of quasi-markets weren't necessarily delivering improvements in NHS services. But I think that following COVID, the real problem is the backlog of ill health conditions, and not having people, everyone knows people that haven't had the operation they were promised 3 years ago or something. Everyone knows this. And that backlog will take a long time to get through. The going to 8 boroughs is, I think the important thing for me is that this authority engages with the agenda because it's happening. So we engage, we try to influence it where we're able to. There will be, it's proposed at the moment, there'll be one chief executive of from the 8 boroughs and one leader from the 8 boroughs that will be representing these 8 boroughs at the integrated care board level. The important thing is that they're going to immediately focus on variations. Everyone, as soon as you're responsible for an area, you look at variations and you know, why is it this area gets more than this area? I've said to them they should focus on variations in resources, in needs, in costs, and also variations in practice. Because if it is the case that you actually have more money being spent in one area per capita than others, and that is the case for us in Westminster, for example, then, and you say, you just look at the resources and you move money from one area to another without regard to variation in practice, and it could be, actually you're not doing the right thing at all. So I do think that the care, it's a big challenge to care because they have to have information about how needs vary across the place, how resources vary, how practice varies, and so that they can make sure this is a fair distribution of NHS services. As soon as you go, it's always been the aim for London NHS that they have an envelope for their area, which is all SDP I used to be a member of, which was in South East London. Half the money to one hospital came from outside London, because it was an sort of international style hospital. So it's all very different. So London is extremely difficult to manage in terms of NHS budget. So you've got to be aware of it, but not get fixated on why is these people getting 10% more than these people. What matters is, first off, is practice. Do you have any unwarranted variation in practice? By that I mean surgery, primary care, all manner of services from the NHS. We overlook that and actually just focus on variation in resource. I think resource is just one dimension. So I would really, and that's something I've said to the leader, and I've said to other chief executives, that there's always this inbuilt tendency to just look at, here's a map of where the money's spent. Look at this and say, no, it's got to change. Actually, there's only one dimension.
Sorry, change in the subject. I was just wondering how we sort of log, analyse and mitigate existential risks. So, for example, I was thinking now, had a couple of councils recently go bankrupt with Croydon and was it Northamptonshire? How, to what extent, and there must be others which have come close and had to go into, had to take extraordinary measures to avoid it. And do we sort of track that, analyse those, and sort of take steps to make sure they won't happen again?
Yes, each of them were of themselves. So each they weren't the same thing happening in different places. But it did tend to be people not being aware of, not being sufficiently prudent, and either going adopting commercial approaches are not advisable, and that tend to be district councils. Which are still arguing that they're doing the right thing, but both sit for their auditors and everyone else is looking.
As long as they just do it for a bit longer, spend a bit more money.
And that's because they're getting a lot of income from a lot of their revenues from commercial income. So councils were told to diversify their revenue. I always thought this was a snark hunt. because there's not much you can, you know, you can get revenues from things and you can spend it on. So our big example, of course, is car parking, where we get more income from car parking, but we can spend it on related transport environmental matters. That supports an awful lot of our service. But those authorities, and we have a very high, we had did examination of this through the independent auditors on Kroll. We have a high source of revenue from rental income, but it's not one rental income, and it's not from owning industrial park somewhere in the suburbs. Our rental income is rental income around here, and therefore we don't have and it's diversified and local, whereas the people went to serious cold on this, essentially invested their discretionary money or their borrowed money to then buy industrial parks, not in their borough. They thought, well, this is you get rental income of this. And of course, the shopping centres can go under. The existential risk often is by people not being aware that they're measuring the risk, both financially but also economically. I'm not sure this. I don't think that we have it's worth us looking at the strategic risk register that we have, because that I think is much broader than it was in the past. We've got what the mitigations are, what the likely risks are. We tend to focus, because I've insisted on this, tend to focus on the risk to the public, and then the risk to other communities, and then the risk to the organisation. But we do include risk to organisation, essentially that financial robustness. But so we could share the information on that strategic risk register. We do financial risk resilience planning. I don't think that we have any existential risks. I think if we had one, it was 5 years ago.
Yeah,
that was a policy decision.
Well, just on the point with other councils, I'm sure many of them are, as you say, sort of overly commercial and sort of high risk commercial activity that we wouldn't get involved in. But you would know better than me, but there might be things in there, and the councils have made mistakes which actually we could make. And just sort of pulling those out.
Well, we recently shared information both about Nottingham, Slough, Croydon, we actually did Northamptonshire, because Northamptonshire was just a policy error, major policy error. I was thinking the government were going to save them. I shouldn't say this. So it's those authorities that made essentially decision errors, going in the wrong direction, taking bigger risks, doing housing development schemes that they didn't properly work through. There have been some major housing development schemes that haven't worked through. And so we have looked at those, we have looked at the lessons from those internally, but you're right, we've always got to look at. And the people that are the best at evaluating this are our auditors. Grant Thornton did Croydon, Nottingham. They're the same auditors for all the big. They're specialists in error and failure. So we certainly have learned.
That's comforting. Thank you, Barry. Will.
I just wanted to say that I think one of the other committees in this council that's led is the audit transparency committee. And I'm chaired the risk register has been grown, and we started that in a small way when I was there. It's been grown a lot since, I know, and welcome that. I'd also welcome and support the point Mary was making about involving select committees in the financial and budgeting. But the area I wanted to ask you about, Barry, was that one of your earlier introductions to the new cohort, this new term, that's the way of putting it, after the elections, was bringing in the concept of 4 I's of intent, instrument, implementation, and impact. And you've also mentioned tonight the strategic challenge is happening through inflation. Some of us older enough to have been through that before, and it's mild but growing, which is the dangerous side of things. But you also, 2 other things that have come out on paper is the area of transitions and metrics, and how this actually ties back to an aspiration of the council plan to be more responsive to our residents. Now, I would like to continue the discussion on the budget, and hopefully that will come out of further meetings yet to be decided. But the question I'm asking to you is that can we look at budget on its own without looking at these other entrances and at least tying into those? Because if we just make the sums add up, that's a great piece of auditing, but it doesn't link the purpose with the impact and whether we're actually getting value for money strategically.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a sort of number of, the first order question is, what do we intend doing? What's the intention of this policy? Then it's, well, what are the instruments of policy? And it could well be that we're locked into one particular instrument, getting out of it and doing something else, given another instrument. So one instrument could well be we have a facility that we invite people into. And we say, the solution is we take the things to them rather than we invite them to our facility, because that facility. And then we say, no, but it's swimming, so we can't do that. We can't take a pool to them. We could take books to them, but we're not proposing that. But there are things, so an instrument of policy could well be giving people back the money, vouchers as an instrument of policy. And so we need to think much more broadly about policy, about instruments, rather than saying, the solution to this is that we have a team of people working on it. Because there's always saying there's intentional policies to do this. This is a problem. The solution to it is to employ people to do something. Actually, no, the solution may well be in the community themselves, and then what we should be doing is empowering them, giving them the cash to do it. So once we've gone through this issue about what is it we intend to do and what instruments, you then got to implement it. And most change, we have teams that are called transformation teams, transition teams. I've rarely seen many things transformed in local government. And yet we've got lots of people in transformation teams. And I'm sure they're doing excellent work, by the way. But genuinely speaking, local government does not change as quick as the needs change. And we say that needs are liquid and services are frozen, and we have to thaw them, change them, then freeze them again. It's sometimes very difficult doing that. Sometimes painful for the organisation, because we have to then change people's roles and do it. Now, we've learned an awful lot in COVID to be in an agile organisation. I said in a recent report, we've got to be more and more multidisciplinary. We can't just have experts in this and experts in that. We'll refer you to the right expert to deal with it. We've got to solve more problems with the community by being multidisciplinary. But I think the fundamental point is that when we're looking at impact, is yes, what is the reach, the impact of this service? What positive difference is it making? And is it cost effective? And comparative cost effectiveness measures are rare. What you'll find is comparative performance measure or a comparative cost measure. You'll rarely find, are we cost effective in one service compared to other authorities and so on? And we need much more of that, I think, in order to make a judgment about, well, okay, so can we move money from this area to that area? Are we moving it into an area that's less cost effective? We've got some excellent services, but we've got high cost services. We are a high resource, compared to other authorities in London, we're a high resource, low needs authority. Therefore, we're providing high quality services, excellent services. The issue is, could we provide excellent services at lower cost? And where are they? So I think cost effectiveness measures are that, people talk about value for money. Value for money is a very slippery concept. It's very difficult to, I often ask people, how much did you have cost to have your hair cut last? What do you think of the quality of it? And now discuss it with your neighbour. No one can agree on whether their haircut is good value for money or not. And yet we think we can agree on complicated things like child protection. So we can't agree on haircuts. How can we agree on this? So I do think we need a much, much more clearer understanding of cost effectiveness. And that's what we're trying to.
Do you think that we could learn from other authorities, or is this very
Well, I think other comparisons are essential, and they're not only in London. So there are some very high-performing authorities outside London, even so far as Yorkshire. Where adult social care is excellent. So there are some authorities that are providing really good services because the demand is such, and they've developed this specialism. Some areas of transport, Bristol, for example. So I do think that learning from other authorities is crucial.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think I'm going to draw that to a close unless anyone else has got any other questions. Barry, thank you very much. I think one of the things that has particularly come out of this is the financial aspect. And that just really inspires me to suggest that those things like cost effectiveness are the matter that scrutiny committees could look into. Whether you do it in a broad brush or just take one service and have a look at it, either way, I think it would be a huge contribution to our general approach to overview. So, and I think also a timely reminder, thank you Greg for that question, about the centrality of benefits, all that we're doing. So thank you very much indeed, Barry, for coming in.
Thank you very much.
Sign this and it gives us a wider view of what's going on in the council. It's really helpful. So our next paper is paper A6, and I forgot to say I spotted a typo which I should have spotted before in 313 where it says praised instead of a prize. Well, I'm sorry I let that. I take it very personally. I'm supposed to looked at all the papers, so I'm very sorry. Right, paper A6. Gabby, are you going to introduce it?
Yes. I'm sorry for the typo. Okay. This is really just another scene setting report because we have some continuing members of the committee, but we've got new members as well. So at your next meeting on the 11th of July, you will as a committee agree the scrutiny work programme as a whole. So you'll agree what the overview committee will do for the year, and then each of the select committee chairs or members of this committee will come with their proposals for what they want to scrutinise both at the formal meetings and in working groups as well. So the report sets out how we as a council decide our scrutiny work programme, scrutiny programme that's councillor led, but which is also very much listening to what the views are of our residents. So I've just set out the principles. So the council takes the approach set out in the statutory guidance for scrutiny from 2019. In talking to the chair, Councillor Wheel, she's been very keen that councillors go out and about as part of the work programme. It isn't just about sitting in this meeting room. And I know councillors said that. So at the last meeting of Housing and Communities, Councillor Ali and Councillor Hammond were both very vocal that they wanted to start going out on visits, and I'm sure the councillors will want to do that. Also, scrutiny listens to view members, so it's important to ask them in, hold them to account, and also has officers come to the committee to provide information and answer questions. There is also a facility, if you wanted to have external experts to come to meetings. So we've done that in the past for the safeguarding reviews, and councillors have found that very useful to get that independent expert information so that you can start to triangulate what you're hearing from residents, league members and officers. Also, Councillor Wheels said she wants more information on performance information, which has been mentioned here. So we're looking to get better performance information, more detailed performance information. So it's about committing to that as a way of working. One thing that has come up is scrutiny of good risk management, which was with this committee. And there's a recommendation that that transfers now to the Environment Select Committee, so you would need to read that as part of this review that you wanted to do that because the expertise sits within that committee. Overview took it up because it was so urgent.
Flood we're talking about, sorry, this is the first one.
Sorry, yeah. They took the flood work up last year because we weren't expecting the floods. Residents were naturally very upset. We heard some stories of what had happened, so that's a recommendation there. And the final bit of the report is just some information about performance indicators for scrutiny, so you can start to think about how scrutiny is performing itself, as well as looking at how the services are performing. So I've put some suggestions in and bring those back as a proposal.
Yes, those look very complicated, those performance measures, but it's very difficult always assessing your own performance. And the other thing you could do is our own self-assessment at some point during the year, how we think each of our committees has operated. Can I throw the floor in? Any comments on any of this? Awesome.
I think in terms of the agenda for this year and the way you're leading for the chairing the scrutiny committees, it's the right direction. And I think what we have done last couple of years under COVID and the restrictions were really tough in terms of not going out, and the plan was to visit some of the housing area issues and see energy efficiency, as well as the homes program, fire safety. But I don't think this year hopefully nothing will stop us. COVID is around the corner. Still managed to go. Hopefully this year. And in terms of coming back and figuring out how well we did or correcting homework, our own homework, I don't think is going to help us. Perhaps maybe each committee can ask the other committee to look into it and see how.
Well, I think we do need to try. I think I agree that it's so tricky, but I think the Centre for whatever it was studies, and scrutiny does suggest that we ought to. Cast a look upon our own performance, and toe curling though it is, I think we need to gird our loins a bit.
Fair enough. Speaking of our own performance, last year I think what we've done was exceptional in terms of conference. We had scrutiny conference for the first time. Actually, twice. One of the housing Councillor Hamid chaired for the housing associations, and it was the first time we've done it the year before, and the second year again we've done it, and it's continuing, because they've never been held accountable for anything. When residents get in touch with us, the council hasn't done it. It's not actually the council, it's the housing association. So it was the residents see as a blame game, not the council, not the housing association.
They just want their problems.
Absolutely, they get service done. But again, that's one thing we have achieved, and I think we will continue to do that. But another important issue is having external experts to come along and to give advice, because normally the way we see stuff and how local government, offices and councillors, slightly different than the other people out there, whether they are professionals or mostly academia. And I think that will be another setting standard for scrutiny to look into. And finally, have the connection between the scrutiny team as well as the lead member that is scrutinizing. That's really important. We've done both years for the two relevant lead members to come along, to come to our committee and to say, this is what we do, this is the year plan for us. Is there any way you would like to ask to explain doing it? So that at least the council of the councillors scrutinizing or select committee members actually know the year ahead of the lead members plan. And that gives us the new members to know more about the vision. And I think that will also another way to look at it. And I think that will help each select committee to understand.
Thank you. Those are really good points.
Yeah, I'd like to endorse everything Kasim says, particularly what we were talking about in the Housing Committee. Just picking up on the point Barry was saying earlier about comparisons with other local authorities, that might be something for Scrutiny to have a look at, and Kasim did touch on. I don't know how we would do that.
Well, there's quite a wealth of sort of stuff available via the sort of local, not the GLA or the LGA. So there is something. The trouble with benchmarking is always apples and pears, and that's how everybody evades doing it. But on the other hand, it's useful to have a stab at it. I mean, you do tend to end up profiling yourselves against similar I mean, it's pointless doing social services stuff against Wiltshire because, you know, one of their big problems is driving from one customer to another, and we just don't compare. But similar-ish boroughs, and then obviously you tease out what the differences are, but I still think it's worth it. So there is quite a lot. I mean, Jackie will kind of delve into it for us, but I think there is quite a wealth available.
When you decide which reviews you're doing, we will work with colleagues. We can work with the LGA to find out. So we did that when you did the Healthy Homes working group report. We got some information from the LGA about our performance.
We did. It turned out to be
Useless.
pretty useless actually. We took the report with caveats because we found all sorts of obvious holes with it. We found holes in the data that was reported about us, and we found holes that for example, with Croydon, the news had exposed problems in Croydon and they weren't reflected in the report. So and that they were just two examples. So
the other is to try and make relationship with another borough, and you know, to you know, work with another borough that we have a positive relationship with, to try and ask them to expose their soft underbelly. I don't know.
I was also thinking, if for instance, I look at where is the best family and children's services in England, and see what they're doing that makes them the best, and maybe you don't have to, you know,
You're sitting in it.
no, just copy or pick pieces that you think might
Cherry
fit
pick
with
good
you.
practice.
Yeah. So it doesn't have to be the whole thing. Just find the best and find out why are they're the best, and see if there is anything you can pick from them.
There might even be an opportunity, sorry to jump in, on certain things to look at international best practice. Sometimes it's just not going to be relevant or compare, but there are
That's exactly what we did for childhood obesity sort of projects.
Just want to pick up on one point Jackie mentioned about priorities from residents. I've been doing a lot of walking around Redcliffe. I've got a number of priorities I've bring to the table. And if I look on page 4 of the report, third bullet point down, it does talk about, in the previous minutes, residents have identified 13 areas of concern, and then it gives some examples. Could that list of 13 areas of concern be shared? Page 4, bullet 3.
It's in the minutes, in the draft minute. Yeah.
Right. Bullet 3, first line. Residents have identified 13 areas of concern. It'd be quite useful to know what this previous areas of concern would be, specifically the ones.
I just had one, I don't know if it's the right place to raise it, just trying to shoehorn it in, but it's on the KPIs and comparators. I think you mentioned this, Sarah, earlier. One of the things they often talk about in America in terms of bureaucracy is how many days does it take to open a hot dog stand, as an example. And it's quite an interesting one. And I just think maybe it's for the OSC as part of the KPIs we look at, but that sort of the ease of bureaucracy, and rather than, you know, just how much money we're spending. How many days, how much time does it take?
That's quite a cross-cutting indicator, isn't it? I said one of the many mad business. I said to Jackie, I was talking to her about perhaps having a monthly newsletter for OSC where we put some of these statistics in, so we don't have to discuss them always at this meeting. But what I'm very keen for us to do is to, you know, we're going to start with some statistics, and you're going to say no, that's not what we want to look at. But we will get there by an iterative process, and then also we want contributions from the member of the public about, you know, what indices are important to them and how their lives are here. So we'll develop it over time. But I think that kind of cross-cutting one is a bit like the sort of international cost of McDonald's, isn't it? It cuts through quite a lot of different issues. So definitely, let's look at doing something like that.
I think another one that's worth looking at, and we haven't used it in the past, is to where we have an area of responsibility. The one I was involved in last year was the environment. we asked through officers to the academics who've been studying the carbon footprint of the borough what the really important things were. Now, I had a prejudice because I'm an architect and engineer, and I thought buildings were important. They've been left out of the analysis for about 10 years when I've been a councillor. Going through the academic study, it turned out to be 90% of the job the council's got to do. And that's why we focused on last year's report on that area. Now, in other areas, there may be, I mean, one thing that's not to come out of the general discussion here has been the public health side of things sufficiently, and how that goes across two of the committees that are around this table. And it isn't in one or the other, it goes across both. The impacts of birth have an impact on adults' outcomes. So there are a number of different dimensions that we perhaps could check this from. Somebody earlier on, Barrett, we talked about multidisciplinary. This is sort of multifaceted analysis. Make sure we get it right so once a week.
In fact, if I would say that all my years in local government, I'm a trained statistician, but the thing which I think was the most impactful on me was a serious case review into the death of a child. And it was a chapter called Being 9 in Deptford. And it was something that was written from the eyes and experience of the child. And I still remember it. And yet so an awful lot of the, I was discussing with staff this morning when we were looking at some community safety data. They didn't tell us quite the right story, didn't quite fit, didn't quite, nothing. I said, we're never going to get to council of perfection on this. We've got to do is to go with the best information that we have, and then always try to improve it. Don't say we're not going to act until we get 100% information. We never will.
Just a quick point on the work program. I think what we haven't managed to do last year, slightly last couple of meetings, was to cover the whole leadership portfolios. For example, Councillor Catherine Fox portfolio hasn't been scrutinized that much, although the last two meetings where we managed to be done. And I think our work program should cover the whole leadership program. And I pretty much like to hear that we have said the budgeting. Once you go into the budgeting, you go everywhere. And every department will be exposed to whatever they're doing. And I think that is what we've started also in housing and communities. First thing we asked was financial feasibility for the financial program. Every bit of how they see it now, 40, 30 years from now. And I think that's what we need to count on. That now that the new lead member has taken on that role, I think Councillor Randall, we need to look into every portfolio so that we know what's happening. And it's directly related to the communities, for example. If we want to support community development, we also need to support local community development, job opportunities, and so on. The second point I would actually think we've identified local authority. This answers your question. We identify local authority. Yes, the two neighbouring local authorities, Hammersmith and Fulham, and Citizens of Westminster, were natural for us because of neighbours. In Camden was the one we've identified through Councillor Dorich Masley about housing safety, and we were planning to visit for 2 years. We never managed to do so. But yes, Camden probably is slightly different, bigger than us. But we thought we could have. We made some contacts through offices. We can do that, and I think we should be further afield.
And I absolutely get we can't do everything. That's the other thing we have to accept. We can't do everything. So one reason for having these statistics and KPIs, which we have off record almost, but for comment and discussion, is that we can get a wider view of the council looking at those, because we have to accept that we can't discuss everything every meeting. Can I draw this to a close unless anyone else to say something else? And I'd quite like to add two sort of things in paragraph 6, Jackie.
Yeah.
And one is sort of supporting, just to put a bit more emphasis on supporting visits outside. I'd like to see, this is just my preference, and we'll be having one in there, see a visit rota for every community. So you allocate a visit to everybody. This is particularly true in adults and children's, but we need to get, just even outside of your topics and looking at things, it would be nice if you went to visit the children's homes on the young people's homes and all of those things, just to get yourself a really good grip of what's going on out there. And that goes for all the committees. And then, you know, officers can help to support that, give you things to go with, contact details, all that sort of thing. And the other thing is just to add that officers will support us with producing statistics and maybe a newsletter outside the meeting. The other thing that newsletter might contain is stuff like what consultations are going on around the council. And I know there's a consultation hub, but it means you have to go there. And I think you should you all deserve to be spoon fed. I certainly do. It's only right going to get to be done on a But I do think it's helpful if you just know what's gone on and what have the results been and what are the leadership teams doing about it. So Jackie and I will work on that and come with a sort of some suggestions.
Can I just add on the visits? We actually years ago had a children's services scrutiny meeting at St Quintin's. And health and wellbeing boards we moved around. Logistically, it's not always very easy, I have to say, it became a bit of a headache for the officers.
You can have, obviously as a committee, you can meet anywhere
Yeah,
you want. And there were plans again to go out before lockdown. So I think housing were going to have a meeting, I can't remember where, they were going to go out and it's just locked down. Just, so you can go out, yeah.
But just something to bear in mind anyway.
You went to Lancaster West.
Like West, we
Yeah.
did different dimensions with the community, community in part of the meeting, technical briefing in part of the meeting.
I think Environment Scrutiny Committee should all get tickets for Holland Park Opera.
That's unkind. Four flavours of like, no, I love it.
think people
Yeah, people.
Not surprised.
Well, the peacock squawks, it'll
not the same.
Or peacock.
Good. Right, have I missed anything else to the agenda?
So,
Item 7, there you go. Thank you. Forward plans, key decisions.
Yeah, just to add you to formally agree the recommendation.
Right. Can we agree the recommendations as augmented?
Agree.
Thank you very much, everybody. I haven't done this for a while. Forward plan and key decisions. Anything leaping out at anyone?
yes, there are a number of that we should add to this. So there's a few that were down to scrutiny on the previous iteration of this, but it's been lost in translation as the
Thank goodness you're here to point this out.
and I'd hate them to get lost. So on the second page, it's actually voting missing ones on the second page. That's the HMO one, which is down for ESC. There's a housing dimension to it as well, but it doesn't matter where it's scrutinised, it needs to be scrutinised. And the housing allocation scheme, I think, is sufficiently contentious that ought to be scrutinised.
Yeah.
And then on the next page, I think tenancy strategy, second one down, the empty home strategy at the bottom, most definitely, because I think we're doing that anyway.
Yeah, it's part of
But that needs to be marked.
Yeah.
I think you're going, for me anyway, just going to the penultimate page, Notting Hill Police Station. I mean, that's down with HSC, but whoever does it, that's pretty high profile, and I reckon that ought to go on the scrutiny programme. Penultimate page,
Yeah. Got it.
So that's a few,
Yeah.
I will leave you my notes so you can tick off my
Yeah.
highlighting.
Yeah.
Those are the ones I've suggested, but there's undoubtedly others.
Kasim and then Tom?
thank you. I'll just finish off with, I think we've pretty much identified everything that's on here. It's for housing will be identified, and page 49, the last one is the council's planning, the CCTV camera. So I think that's also something we talked about for security reasons. We had, I can't remember the conference we had, or was it with the community safety team?
It was the group councillor,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah,
A long time now, yes.
More than happy to add that.
Absolutely, I think pretty much everything that's about housing should be there. We identify as important to improve
One I was going to add is the Locks Road South Design Brief. I don't know whether that come in environment or housing.
It's environment.
Environment.
It's a planning brief.
Oh, yeah,
It's
exactly.
also linked into the neighbourhood plan decision as well. It's two different key KDs, but they link
Yeah.
in together.
Okay. So yeah, maybe we can pull that into ESC. Should give that attention.
Thank you.
Can I ask one of Kasim? Are
Yes.
you? I remember last year Taryn telling us that the analysis of the shortfall on the HRA, £100 million, from the 2030 commitment for our housing, was something that's going to be worked through the medium-term financial strategy this summer, which is going to go back substantial answers on that. So presumably early in the autumn, get some feedback on that. I mean, it's certainly something I want to look at from an OSC point of view, but it will be rooted in the answers you get from her on that.
Absolutely. I think in the autumn or kind of mid-autumn, we'll probably look into that.
Because it was also in the manifesto in the recent election as well, £100 million commitment to that direction. So
We'll go into that.
the sourcing of that is going to be from a number of different places, like internally and externally, and borrowing, government and borrowing.
Yeah, I will be reaching out to Karen. I think she's mostly visible when the budget is happening, but mostly yes, we will reach out to her.
But she flagged, I think it was August, is it? Yeah. Medium-term financial strategy. And obviously you're talking about that internally, so we'll be ready to talk to us about it later in the summer.
Yes. Also, sorry, just to finish off the point we've said, page 51. We have included that one, the medium to high supported housing services for young people. The issue is we haven't looked at very similar to that, and I think it's about time to look into the medium to high supported homes.
That's already been decided.
But has it been for last time? I don't think we just scrutinized because it's very much similar. And the social care, it's cost cutting between social care as well as housing. I don't think we have looked at it properly last time.
So I think the
The
first and White
decision
House
has to
service
be
is
made,
being-
isn't it?
Yeah.
The decisions we make probably can revisit. One of the things we've talked about the scrutiny was, yes, every decision has to be made and council usually must make decisions, but of councillors and maybe officers' suggestions should be open to as to develop. For example, one of the things we talked about was 5 years tenancy agreement, not to be looked at. 5 years of decisions being made, locked, nothing can be changed. I don't think that's the best way of going, and I think it would be good to continuously improve the council services as well as decision making. I understand that's what we've also mentioned last scrutiny for housing and communities. I don't know if this could be pretty much related to that. It's good to look into the young people's supported homes.
You want to put that on your work programme?
It's already been decided, but I was thinking maybe update to get an update of how.
So that's an information question. So yes, why don't you ask Jackie
Probably,
to chase it up for you and get an update?
get an
That's
update.
only started in
Yes.
March of this
But
year.
but maybe it's worth having an update in 6 months' time to see how it's
Yes.
gone.
Rather than,
But-
yes.
If we're trying to kind of keep the information items off the agenda, but yes, ask the question.
Yeah, or if it's already it's already happened, I'm not sure why it's on this.
No,
Probably it's to get our attention. To get our attention.
there are a couple of older looking ones on there.
There are. Change.
We'll
We can talk to you if you want to do it. I think it's a good contract.
we'll look into whether it should have been on there, and if it was on there and shouldn't have been, why?
It's on page 49.
Yes, I'm.
She doesn't have a date though.
It's February.
It starts on the 1st of September.
Sorry.
On the start.
Well, do you want to start?
I just wanted to ask Warren, in your FCS committee, how important and how urgent do you regard the white paper that's currently out for schools and maths?
It's actually one of the things I discussed. I wanted to put in our working program, but I was told I guess we need to wait for the white paper to come out because funding is extremely crucial. And
What paper is that?
it's the white paper for, you talk about the funding?
No,
Coming
it's not. No.
So we can discuss this when we discuss the work
Oh,
programme.
not to totally
Possible.
that's out.
Oh, okay. I was talking about the.
Any other business from anybody? Or may I close the meeting? Thank you, everybody, very much indeed.
I like it.